Okie dokie. Welcome to whatever week this one is. We're doing Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. So this reading doesn't really address what virtue ethics is at all. You have to go much further into the Nicomachean Ethics, but I didn't feel like it would be moral, virtuous of me to assign 50, 60 pages of Aristotle for 1 week's lecture course. So I gave you what is one of the coolest and most fun and famous passages from the Nicomachean Ethics, the very beginning. And what I'll do to start off the lecture is just sort of talk about what virtue ethics is, as opposed to what we studied last week in deontology and utilitarianism, how we should be thinking about virtue, and then go back to Aristotle and run through his arguments about happiness, eudaimonia, and we'll sort of place those conceptual, the conceptual apparatus of the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics into an understanding of virtue ethics generally. Okay, so what is the good life? So last time we read Anscombe, right? And we talked about utilitarianism and deontology and why these are generally problematic views about the good life, about moral systems at all. So in Modern Moral Philosophy, the paper that we read, Anscombe says, look, these thinkers, Sidgwick and Hare specifically, the British empiricists, the consequentialists, are codgy and dry and, quote, stupid, right? Because they're making decisions about what is good that no actually good person out in the world would make. We should recall the example of the person who's saying, look, it's okay to sometimes allow an innocent person to be executed in a court system if all the evidence points to their having done it, but they didn't actually do it. So think if you've seen the movie 12 Angry Men, super famous movie, or what is it, The Green Mile is the other one with Tom Hanks, right? These are those sorts of stories that you'd say, look, all of the evidence points to these people doing it. And so it's just that we kill them even though they're innocent. Because the rule usually works that when we have a bunch of evidence and then they're guilty. She says this sort of person just isn't someone who would claim this, isn't someone who is qualified to be talking about good at all. And this is why consequentialists are kind of stupid. We did a bunch of trolley problem cases, right, where we're measuring 1 life versus 5 lives and looking at pushing people over bridges and just sort of pumping intuitions to say that, look, ethics understood in this other way is complicated. So the problems with these two ways of thinking is that they're unresolvable and pedantic. We run into issues that we just can't deal with. In real life, do you lie to the axe murderer? Well, of course you do, hopefully, right? But is this consistent with the rational duty that we have to act in accordance with maxims that are universalizable? No. And there we get tension, right? That makes the moral system look kind of stupid. There are better ways, argues Anscombe, to normatively evaluate the world and our lives, to decide on what counts as good and bad. And I might use the word normative. It's kind of a jargony term. It just means value laden, right? So prescriptive, normative, moral, value laden, all of these is a family of words that just mean that we're not talking empirically or descriptively about the world, but rather we're talking about the meaning and value of the world. So if I use those words, that's what I'm talking about. So what Anscombe ends up doing is saying, look, what's the right direction to go in ethics is to take an emotive turn, is to not worry about what makes something just or unjust, good or bad, but rather what it means to be courageous or what it means to be cowardly, and to attach our normative and evaluative thinking, our normative evaluative concepts generally, to real human experiences, and then tie those human experiences together into a moral system, which, look at that, Aristotle did about 2,000 years ago, and it's called virtue ethics. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is virtue. but we'll motivate the problem one more time. So this is Susan Wolf. She's a contemporary philosopher. She's awesome. So imagine the perfect utilitarian who, like this Superman utilitarian, there's a criminal stealing an old woman's purse, and he zaps him and then sucks out all of his organs and then donates all the organs to like 5 sick people just for trying to steal a purse, right? But he saved 5 lives. So like, he's doing good. And now imagine the perfect deontologist. This sort of person is the one who says, oh yeah, axe murderer, the person you want to murder is in the living room. Have a good time, right? And so what Susan Wolf wants us to do is to imagine the perfect versions of the deontologist and the utilitarian. She calls them moral saints, okay? Are these moral saints, these people who follow the rule of law of this particular moral system, the sort of people that we would want to spend time with, the sort of people that we would admire and look up to, right? Would you look up to someone who, this utilitarian man who like sucked out the organs of people and gave them just for stealing a purse? Or would you look up to the Kant bro who never lies because it's not in alignment with his rational duty to act in accordance with the maxims such that you never treat others merely as means, but always at the same time as ends in themselves, and always justifies themselves by saying exactly that? No, it'd be really irritating. These people would be like the worst people. You would never want to spend time with them. You would never want to have a conversation with them. You wouldn't want them as your roommate, certainly in the case of the axe murderer, right? These moral saints are not heroes. But when we think of good people that we idolize, they're certainly not like this, right? Everybody has skeletons in their closet or weaknesses. We're all human, right? But it's in the quality of overcoming. It's in the quality of like what makes us good in spite of our weaknesses, that we like value people and that we see how they're good and how they overcome, right? And you're not allowed to have weaknesses. You're very rigid as a moral saint of one kind or the other. And this is Susan Wolf's objection to utilitarianism and deontology, that look, the exemplars of these systems aren't people that we think are good or that we want to be around, but a virtuous person, an exemplar of a virtue or a set of virtues. These are people that we look up to and admire. So this must have something to do with the good life, right? That we actually care about and want to live. So what is a virtue? I'm talking a lot about virtue ethics, virtue in general, motivating it as the alternative to these poor moral systems, the alternative ones. What is it at all? So this is Linda Zagzebski. She was one of my mentors in college. She's awesome. And she pioneered virtue epistemology. So the idea is that knowledge isn't just a justified true belief, like remember Descartes, justified true belief, but knowledge is when you are a good knower, right? It's when you've processed your belief states, the epistemic content of your mind, through the net of epistemic virtues. So when you're humble and creative and open-minded and critical, these sorts of things, right? That these values are what make knowers, not the fact of truth or the fact of justification, the fact of belief, all tied together. So similar with virtue ethics, what makes a good person is not the intention that they set or the consequences of their actions, but rather some certain set of moral characteristics, qualities of personhood, humanness, that makes you good. So as she defines it, a virtue can be defined as a deep and enduring acquired excellence of a person, involving a characteristic motivation to produce a certain desired end and reliable success in bringing about that end. So let's break down this definition. So there's 4 conditions with a 5th hidden one that you don't get from this, but this is Linda's view. It ends up being kind of fun and controversial. So we'll talk about that at the end. But the 4 conditions at least present in this definition is 1, that a virtue is an acquired excellence of the soul. So some like human characteristic. It's acquired by a process that involves time and work on the part of the moral agent. So you have to work at developing these character traits. That a natural capacity is not enough to count as a virtue. You have to like intentionally produce it in yourself. A virtue is not simply a skill. So it's not something that we're good at doing. It may involve skill. There might be like skill in virtue, but it's not a skill in itself. Like being a really good basketball player does not make you a really good person, right? The skill is broken away from the quality of goodness. It's a character trait with like its own intrinsic value. It's its own distinct thing from a skill. And virtue has a motivational component. So we haven't talked about it, but a big question in ethics generally is why be moral, right? Why be a good person at all? This is a problem. And it's a problem because any moral theory will want to be able to answer that question with its own content. It's like the utilitarian will want to say, look, what's good is whatever maximizes utility. And also you should maximize utility because I'm a moral theory and I want you to like be good people. But why, we might agree that, look, maximizing utility is a good thing. But why should I want to maximize utility generally? Why shouldn't I just be like my own personal hedonist, right? The motivational component, the part that not only tells me what the good is, but like compels me to do it, is not attached so clearly to utilitarianism, but seems to be in virtue. Insofar as there's a character trait, we dispose in ourselves this motivation to do good, that you don't just know what it is to be courageous, but given the opportunity to be courageous, you do it because you're motivated to be. Right? And then the fifth hidden condition is that the virtue is successful in bringing about its end. This one is controversial. You might want to take it or leave it, but we'll talk about that. So let's break it down. First is virtues and acquired excellence. So virtues is faculties or traits. Some argue that virtues are something like natural capacities, that like you might be really good at jumping very high, or at reading really fast, or at spitting really far. I don't know, natural capacities, whatever these are, you just have it like this inborn trait. And we might imagine someone that is pre-reflectively good. You look at them and you think, wow, this is like a virtuous person. They just have like this natural capacity to be good and do well. They're naturally intelligent or strong or compassionate, whatever. The definition that Linda gives, that I'm convinced by at least, would say that these natural capacities aren't enough for virtues. So recall again Mungza, right? When Mungza says, look, we all have these sprouts, these little like motivational cues in each of us that could be like mowed over. Okay. The sprouts are kind of like natural capacities, that they might help you with the virtue, but a virtue is something that is more robust, that requires reflective work that we invest into. It's a character trait that's built, and the natural capacity isn't enough to build in what you might want to call the sort of content that allows you to get praise and blameworthiness out of it. So if what we're calling a virtue is a character trait, an excellence of the soul, a natural capacity is something that you just have, something that you're given maybe by like biology or like grace of God or fate, whatever, right? It's something that happens to you, right? It's like having blonde hair. But if you want to be praised or blamed for your behavior, the accidental fact of your hair being blonde or whatever color is not enough to say like, oh wow, you're such a good person, or I'm so glad that your hair is blonde, right? Like I didn't do that, right? That's not up to me. But if I work on it, if I qualify and intentionally say like I color my hair brown or whatever, then you might say like, hey, you did good, right? You colored your hair the right color. That is something that can be praised or blamed because we're invested in it. So same thing with this, a natural capacity is not enough for a virtue, it's something that we have to invest in. Just as with the sprouts, it's not the sprout that makes the virtue, but our cultivation of the sprout into its virtue that gives it its sort of like moral content. Okay, so we earn our virtues. So as Aristotle says, we have the faculties by nature, like sprouts, but we are not made good or bad by nature. Aristotle and important. Aristotle is just saying, like, look, the virtues are something that we develop in ourselves. It's plain that none of the moral virtues arise in us by nature, for nothing that exists by nature can form a habit contrary to its nature. For instance, a stone which by nature moves downwards cannot be habituated to move upwards, not even if one tries to train it by throwing it up 10,000 times. And I like to imagine Aristotle throwing a rock uphill 10,000 times. Nor can fire be habituated to move downwards, nor anything else that by nature behaves in one way be trained to behave in another. Neither by nature then, nor contrary to nature, do the virtues arise in us. Rather, we are adapted by nature to receive them and are made perfect by habit. So habit is an important feature of a virtue ethical system. That let's compare deontology and utilitarianism to virtue ethics here. So there's the hypothetical or the categorical imperative in Kant's system, right, where you're thinking in terms of the principle of humanity, or the principle of universalization of maxims, right? Or in the case of the utilitarian, you're doing the utility calculus, you're maximizing and aggregating the upshot and downsides of any decision. You're thinking through what makes something good and then choosing based on your rational calculation. For Aristotle, none of that should come into play. Look how important habit is in this context, that we all have natural capacities to roll downhill or uphill, but through habit, humans have the ability to change those natural capacities, to edit them to flow upstream. And sometimes we have to do that. But what does habit do for us is it doesn't just allow us to subvert the natural capacity. It also allows us to not need to calculate at all. It just happens, right? So here's two cases. There is an elderly person about to cross the street. It's a busy street. And cars are aggressively wanting to turn right through the crosswalk. And this person is not able to make themselves visible enough, or even walk assertively enough to stop the cars, and so get stuck in the middle of the street, right? And there you are, wherever you are, one side of the street or the other. And you think to yourself, I could go help this elderly person, but does it maximize utility? Will everybody be better off? Should the cars turn right? And are they going important places that are less important than where this elderly person is going? Or if you're the deontologist, you think, how do I universalize the maximum action? In fact, what is the maximum action? How do I do it, right? This is not doing good. The elderly person is still in the middle of the street. They need help, right? Even for the person who ascribes to virtue ethics, I think, is it virtuous to do this? Right? Is it virtuous to go help this person or not? This reflective moment is a pause. It's a break between the necessity that the world calls for, helping this person, and your decision to do it. There's a gap, right? But what habit does is it just happens, right? Things we're habituated to do, like Pavlov's dogs, when the bell rings, the mouth salivates. Similar idea with virtue, that you don't have a full virtue until the actions just happen. You see the elderly person in the middle of the street, they need help, and you go and help them, right? And it's through habit that this natural capacity can become a deliberate effort that goes, against or with the natural capacity, if you're lucky, but happens of its own intentional accord. That doesn't require this reflection. It just occurs. This is what makes it good. So virtues are active, they're praiseworthy, and they're formed through habit. So another important thing about virtues for Aristotle is this doctrine of the mean. Okay, so this is an important Aristotelian concept, that a virtue is not just a character trait of like doing well or doing good, but it's an emotive one, right? So for instance, one such example of a virtue, like one of the core Aristotelian virtues, is courage. Okay, but what is courage? Courage is the middle path of on one end cowardliness, and on the other end brashness. So think of a soldier. This is Aristotle's example. It says the courageous soldier does not run too far ahead of his unit, right? Or else he just gets murdered, and that's it. The brash soldier who seeks glory and honor just murdered right away because they've made a stupid decision, and that's not virtuous, right? Nor is the cowardly soldier virtuous, for they stay behind and let their brothers in arms go to war and die without them. It's certainly not virtuous either. But what's courageous is striking the mean, that middle between the excess and the deficiency of this character trait, of this emotive human quality. So every virtue for Aristotle is striking a balance between what's too much of some habituated quality, emotive quality of the soul, and what's too little of that habituated emotive quality of the soul. And the excellence, it's excellent because it hits the meat. There's this thing called phronesis, phronesis. It translates to practical wisdom. And practical wisdom is like a developed intellectual skill just by living in a state of virtue, like around virtuous people, that you develop, where you just kind of know what the mean is for different emotive qualities. So the fully virtuous person is someone who's developed this phronesis, but that's how you know the mean. Because, for instance, being a healthy person, okay, like physically healthy, requires eating a certain amount of calories. And if we all followed the same rules, if we all ate 2,000 calories a day, some of us would be okay, but others wouldn't, right? So 2,000 calories is not the mean between excess and deficiency of caloric intake. The bodybuilder might need 6,000 calories, right? Whereas I don't know, wayfish diabetic type 1 person might need like 1,000 calories or whatever to keep their blood sugar levels fine, right? So whatever the mean is relative to the circumstances that you're in. And again, this is like where habit becomes important. Habit is that through which like phronesis automatically occurs in us to strike the mean in decision making. But it's important to note that virtues are context sensitive in this case. They're excellences of individual souls, but they're excellences that operate relative to context and not because of some like universal law to do duty or to maximize utility. What makes your life good? What makes life in general good? And what's the middle ground between these two questions? And how do we habituate ourselves emotionally to be attuned to acting in that sort of way? This is what a virtue is. They take time. Their achievements. So again, like the sprout metaphor is good. Mengzi and Aristotle are like tied together in comparative philosophy for this reason, that virtue, says Aristotle, only follows from a firm and unchangeable character. It's when we've firmly habituated ourselves into having these character traits and acting with them well and in the middle between excess and deficiency that we can be called virtuous. And it's an achievement. And this is in part what makes it praiseworthy. When you want to say someone's a good person, they've earned it, right? It just hasn't happened to them. It's because we have to work on it with intention that this sort of automatic state of just going and helping the elderly person across the road can be praised. So how about this? You're at the doctor and they knock your knee and it kicks, right? Or you are lecturing in front of your class and you kick your knee, right? These are two different qualities of actions. Right? When the doctor does it, it just happens of its own accord. I didn't do that. And you can't say like, good job, you kicked, right? Because I didn't do it. It happened to me. But when I kick my leg intentionally, there's a different kind of like structure of the action than in the doctor case. And the different structure allows us to justify praise or blame. We can say like, look, you did that. Same thing with a virtue, that if a virtue needs to be habituated so that it just happens, like you're looking at the elderly person trying to cross the street, it's no good if you have to stop and think, but it's probably also no good if it's not your fault that you helped the person, however that might turn out. Just like imagine it's possible, but you're helping the elderly person across the street is analogous to the doctor hitting your knee. That wouldn't be a virtue. You wouldn't deserve praise or blame for that. But in developing these skills, we set intentions into ourselves. We say, look, I want to be this kind of person, and I'm going to work on it and become better over time. That when the actions that are good happen automatically through us, we can say, look, through time, you've like chronically embedded the important sort of intentions into yourself. So even though you didn't have to think about it, in fact, you shouldn't have thought about it, because you didn't think about it, and because this isn't something that's natural to you, that we can say like, you're virtuous and you're a good person, I want to be like you. It's not simply a skill. Sort of talked about that already. There's a motivational component, talked about that too. Okay, so this is another way of characterizing the same point, kind of an interesting way of doing it too. So dispositions can be natural dispositions, and they can be intelligent dispositions. So for instance, glass has a disposition to shatter when hit. It is brittle. A virtuous person has a disposition to help the elderly person across the street when they need help because they're generous, right? But the sorts of dispositions in either of these cases are not the same. They're disanalogous, right? That the glass has this natural disposition that it didn't do anything to be that way. It just is that way given metaphysically how it's structured, what it is. The virtuous person is different from the glass door insofar as their disposition is something that they put there, right? It still is like the glass in that when the right input is given, the following action occurs, but there's a whole like intentional history in the virtue case that isn't there with the glass case. Okay, the glass doesn't have a desire to break; it just does. And although the virtuous person also just does act virtuously, they can be said to like be motivated to act virtuously insofar as that's a part of the disposition that they've intentionally structured in themselves through training and work and all this. What's a good example? Maybe like an alcoholic, for instance, who goes to rehab and has these drives to drink, though they know that if they drink, it'll cause all sorts of trouble for them and their loved ones and all this. So what they do is they work on it, on their intentions and those drives, and they restructure in themselves systems that help them to overcome those drives with stronger drives, with drives to remain sober, for instance. And so when given the opportunity to have a drink, they automatically say no. Even though there might be some motivation to have a drink, like they want it, they're more motivated to remain sober. And the motivation isn't something that they have to think about. In the case of like, say, a long-term sober alcoholic, they don't have to think about it. They just like say no to the drink when it occurs, but it's an automatic reaction that comes with a motivational component. Virtues are the same sort of way. You just want to do it because you've trained yourself through the analogous sort of work that the alcoholic might do in overcoming their disease and or biological affliction. Addiction is incredibly complicated. There are really good reasons to think of addiction as like a biomedical problem, and also really good reasons to think of it as like a cultural existential problem. So like AA works really well and it's therapy, but it treats addicts as addiction as like a cultural thing, not as like a pre-genetic condition. or like a physiological alignment. But then, there's also physiological facts of addiction and pre-genetic conditions and all this that make it complicated to deal with. And then you get like moralizations on both sides. That like people who think of addiction as a biomedical condition might look down on what AA is doing and treating it as an existential one. And you might call like someone like a drunk, it's like a negative social stigma that doesn't help. But yeah, there's a whole philosophy in this literature too. It's fun stuff.
It sounds like we need more ways to treat people with addictions, just more different ways that help the person more, because some different treatments might help the person more than others,
Yeah, exactly. Right. So depending on who you are, what kind of addiction, like context sensitive. Yeah, there are good reasons to ascribe yourself to either strategy or, like degrees of both. But it's pretty much always right that, in my estimation, that the answer to these kinds of problems is usually the more complex one. And it's usually always the case that we, being like humans, institutionally resist the more complicated answers because they're more complicated and usually expensive, and that they're complicated too. But yeah, if you're interested in this issue, I don't know, with my example, yeah, sorry, soapboxing on my example. There is like a whole philosophy of science area where this gets dealt with. You can take classes in it.
Which is a great example of cultural addiction, I would say, to vodka specifically. Society kind of forces Russians normally to drink vodka. There's actually this there's these bottles in Russia that make it so it's impossible to take the cap off once you've taken it off, because it's just assumed that a Russian would drink the entire bottle in one sitting.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a great example of cultural addiction, I would say.
Yeah. That's cool stuff. Thanks for sharing. Okay. Where the hell are we with virtue ethics? A virtue is like a disposition. It's a disposition. It's motivational content. We are ethically committed to bringing about a better state of affairs for the world, and we act virtuously because we've worked it into ourselves that way. Talked about this. So this meme is a nice example that you can fail successfully, right? So we might accidentally act virtuously, but this isn't enough. That we want to build into ourselves the right sort of intentional systems that act automatically, but in the background, there's a whole set of like intelligent, intentional structure that inspires us to act when given the right sorts of inputs. This is what I work on. It's what I'm writing my dissertation on with respect to expertise in all fields like art and sports and stuff, medicine. The idea is that the expert is able to just react, right? But their reactions are intelligent reactions to the world, and they're flexible and they can shift and change. They can remain context sensitive without having to like go through the process of thinking what I ought to do. The expert has trained in themselves the ability to just react to the world well, but that doesn't mean that their reactions are rote, mechanical, without an underlying structure of intelligence going on in the background. Same idea with a virtuous person here, right? The virtuous person is the one who's developed in themselves the skill of acting automatically in a context-sensitive way to different situations in accordance with the good life and living the good life and helping others live the good life. But in the background of those automatic reactions to the world have a whole like intentional structure, the excellence of the soul that they've built into themselves. Okay, so the hidden fifth conditions, that's the fun one. So imagine that an apartment building is on fire and, oh no, Baby Yoda is in the ceiling, the roof, the top floor, and he's crying for help. Grogu is eeping or whatever cute noise he makes loudly to get the attention of the firefighters. Somebody save this cute creature. And so Brave, or is he, unless, firefighter runs up the burning stairs to go save baby Yoda. What a hero, and he dies. The firefighter dies. Game over. Who knows what happened to Baby Yoda? Um, is the firefighter courageous?
Yes.
Takes courage, doesn't it? Is the firefighter virtuous? Yes.
I wouldn't say virtuous.
You wouldn't say virtuous. Okay, cool. Don't always get a dissenter. Why would you say that? Why would you hedge your attribution of virtue?
Because virtue is, in a sense, like getting yourself all the way, till death. So if you're like just gonna run into a time where you could like die, that's not really virtuous. It's not like enlightening to anyone else. It's just you're running in and being, I don't know, like a hero. Virtuism, at least from, maybe I have it wrong, but isn't really being the hero. It's just like having all the knowledge.
Yeah. So this is Zagzebski's, Linda's point. She would say that the firefighter is not virtuous, that they might have acted on the courageous spectrum, but with too much. Right? They were brash. And because, for exactly the same reason, Kyle, this is Linda's argument, for exactly the same reason, because they won't be around anymore. They're not standing up as an exemplar. They're not there to show the world what it is to act well. They died, right? They failed. The failure of the act is not representative of what it is to live a good life. It's representative of what it is to try to live a good life and be stopped. So you thought it was courageous.
Yeah.
Do you think he's virtuous too?
I think in a sense, yes, because if baby Grogu was up there, there was nobody else around who had the capacity and training to even potentially save him.
Mhm.
So just the act of even trying when he was the only one who could is an act of courage, which I think is a virtue.
Right.
So the failure doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't act in courage. It just means that the circumstances were outside of his realm of possibility, but he was the most.
And maybe he didn't know that the circumstances were outside the realm of possibility.
Yeah.
Right. So we might want to say that he was partly virtuous, maybe in this case. Partly virtuous in the case that the firefighter acted with courage, but miscalculated because they were lacking like some other virtue about like knowing well what situations will certainly cause their death or not. So how about this? Let's change the case a little bit. Let's say, as you described, only this firefighter has the knowledge and equipment and capacity to save Baby Yoda at the top floor of this burning building. And they know for certain that if they go into that burning building, they will die. Should they do it? Would it be virtuous to go in and try anyways?
No, it'd just be brash.
It'd be suicide. Yeah. So this is, again, this is why Linda thinks that success is an important condition, but also why it's controversial, right? That success is essential to this construction of like what a virtue is, because if you had all of the virtues, like if you were like the perfect person, the Ubermensch or whatever, Aristotle's Ubermensch, you would just know, right? Your phronesis would be complete. You have the practical wisdom to like it's just a tragedy, isn't it, when Baby Yoda burns to death in that building. I wish I could save them, but I can't. But at the same time, you still want to like respect the firefighter like running into the building and trying, right? That there is some kind of courage going on there in a different sort of way than the warrior who just like runs ahead of their phalanx unit or whatever and like breaks the whole chain of spears. It's a different kind of brashness.
I think it's because the fire is just chaotic. Like the building on fire just is a very chaotic situation and you're not really guaranteed to die. but there is a chance still there that you could
Yeah,
just end
so-
up dying.
This is interesting too. I hadn't thought about this, that there's like a probability factor in the enacting of virtue, right? So what does the probability have to be, do we think? Just like posing this question because I think it's kind of interesting. Where do we think like the degree of probability has to be for failure success, where courage flips over into brashness or cowardliness in the other direction, right? So if there's a 90% chance of success and a 10% chance of failure, and the firefighter chooses no, like 10% is too much for me, would they be a cowardly firefighter?
Yeah, I would say they'd be a coward in that case. That's just too low of a chance.
Yes, but do we have an intuition about like how high or low the percentages of success and failure could be? Like, just throw a number out.
Maybe like if it's like 75%, like 70% chance that they would die, that's when it'd go into like too brash, I would
Okay.
say. It's somewhere like 60 to 40%, I would say somewhere around there is
Somewhere in there.
when you're just brave.
Man, even a coin toss to me seems, maybe I'm cowardly, but that seems pretty damn risky, right?
Yeah, that's why I'd say it's like 40 to 60% chance, the
Yeah.
sweet spot there.
Does anybody else have intuitions about this? Should we even be thinking about like the mean as a probabilistic mode, or?
I don't like it because it feels like it puts contingencies on the virtue that are distinct from the virtue
Yeah.
itself that we're trying to measure and judge. Now there's this other calculus to be the determiner of if the original virtue is virtuous, which
Good.
then we have to qualify with the secondary action or contingency is also virtuous, but that will probably have a contingency paired with the fact that the determination of success and failure is very ambiguous, i.e. if he knew he was going into a suicide mission, but that's what he intended to do.
Yeah,
That was the end he was intending to succeed with, then that would be a successful mission.
yeah,
Yeah, and like I think that could be differentiated from something like brashness, because if you just like, if he just like, no shot, just killed himself before he went in, that's successful, but also brash.
Yeah.
But if he achieved his mission, that could be a courageous act, even if, you know what I mean?
yeah, yeah. So I feel that too, right? That thinking too hard about it doesn't feel very virtuous to me. But then so Aristotle has given himself phronesis as a conceptual tool, saying, hey, it's a thing that exists, and we're not going to make these calculations. You're just going to have the practical wisdom that allows you to know like what's good and bad in these cases, and that maybe the addition of like a probability measure and deciding what, like, say like we're not virtuous, but we're trying to learn, we're like setting in the intentional structure in ourselves, motivating and disposing ourselves to be courageous. So we're asking ourselves, maybe doing that kind of calculation is one thought too many for virtue, right? That if you're setting this dispositional structure in yourself through training, like become a virtuous person, that thinking about it being reflective is good, but there might be an overstep in your reflective consideration of virtue, that beginning to quantify the good with the bad takes you away from the spirit of like the emotive quality of a virtue. So yeah, point taken. I think it's an interesting comment. Cool. Yeah, so this is why I include this, because I think it's like an endlessly interesting like point. And I think Linda's argument is really good for it. I'm kind of halfway convinced by it, but I'm only halfway convinced by argument that like success is a condition of virtue, like academically, right? That like it's just a good argument, and I can't, when thinking conceptually about what a virtue is, I don't know if I would want to or could come up with a better account that didn't have it. But then I think like in practice, virtue needing to be successful, like it just seems kind of absurd. Like, of course, the firefighter's brave. Like, look at him running up to save Baby Yoda, right? That's a brave act. And not knowing that it's a suicide mission certainly like couldn't be that brash. Like they probably run into burning buildings all the time. maybe not to always save the cutest being in all of existence, but it's just another good reason to call a person courageous.
I wonder if the firefighter was doing this for selfish reasons, like he wanted to become like famous for saving Baby Yoda as well.
Or had a death wish.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I don't think that would be great for Aristotle. Your motivation can't, your motivation for acting is, for Aristotle, for the sake of flourishing and living the good life. And if your motivation is for some bad reason, inconsistent with eudaimonia and flourishing, and yet you do an act consistent with eudaimonia and flourishing, that Aristotle wouldn't want to call you good. You got to have like the right motivation, which is living well. And sometimes living well and being bad overlap, unfortunately. But that's not to say that like ego and pride and stuff are bad. Like I think pride is just as well a character trait that you can have in excess and deficiency, and should count as a virtue in its own right. What do you think the excess of pride would be? Too proud? Or is pride the excess of something? I'm just thinking like emotion words, right?
I think pride is the excess of like self-respect.
Okay.
Maybe like arrogance.
Yeah. So we could have like self-respect be the mean and pride be the excess, or pride be the mean, meaning self-respect, and then arrogance being the excess. What would be the deficiency? Because humility is a virtue too. But it would be something like being too
Thinking you just like can't help in any situation even if you could, maybe.
Yeah, it's like being completely self-denigrating or something, right? But again, this kind of conversation, like what is the excess or deficiency of these particular emotions? Do these particular emotions have excesses and deficiencies? These are the sorts of conversations that are had in virtue theory, right? When we're talking about virtues as like an ethical system, when we're talking about like what is the good, these are the kinds of conversations that are had, not how much utility is qualified by this consequence versus that one, right? And this is what Anscombe wants us to do, right? It's like, let's forget that other way of thinking. Like, let's talk about like human emotions and what matters to us, and how we know how to communicate with each other through our actions and through our emotions. And I think these are just more interesting conversations anyways. Not only is utilitarianism stupid, quote, it's kind of boring, to be honest, if you ask me anyways. Okay. So there you go, that's virtue. So these are Aristotle's character virtues. There's certainly more, right? There's probably plenty more, but these are the ones that Aristotle lists. Courage, temperance, liberality, magnificence, magnanimity, ambition, patience, friendliness, truthfulness. There's also intellectual virtues. So a character virtue is a virtue that we exercise through action. In book, I want to say it's 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, and later on, Aristotle introduces a distinction between character virtues and intellectual virtues, where character virtues are performed through actions, intellectual virtues are performed through contemplation, and that the true good life is the contemplative life, the life of a philosopher. Surprise, a philosopher says that being a philosopher is what it is to like be living the perfect life. I don't disagree, but look at me. And virtues of the mind are different from virtues of the body, for instance. As I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, Linda Zagzebski sees all these problems in contemporary epistemology and says, hey, let's just go back to Aristotle, right? Let's think about knowledge in terms of thinking well. And these would be ways in which we think well, that your intellect is adaptable, that you can recognize authority, that you recognize reasonable epistemic dependence and unreasonable epistemic dependence, that you're charitable in argument and discussion, that you're open-minded, these sorts of things, right? Creative. And this is what a system of ethics is based on, that we know people are good when they're like this, right? Not when they calculate well or when they set right intentions and then allow an axe murderer into the room. No, right? What makes people good is when they have these good qualities. So there's a form of virtue ethics. It's called exemplarism. And the idea is similar to Rachel's point earlier, that let's not think too hard about virtues. At least, like, let's not overthink what virtues are. Because through reason alone, we can't derive virtues, nor even know what a good life is. The good life and what virtues are they're emergences from like actual lived life. That we look at people that we respect and we admire and how they live, and we see them as exemplars. We see them as people who embody certain virtues, and then we act like them. We appropriate their good qualities and hopefully acquire our own form of them and our own form of a good life consistent with the way that they are. So the way that a virtue is derived and then acquired through ourselves is by looking up to a hero, right? Picking out an exemplar and saying, I want to be like this person. So what I want us to do is break into small groups for just a couple of minutes and pick an exemplar. Somebody in your life, could be someone famous, someone nobody knows, a family member, whatever. Someone dead or alive, fictional or real. That's an exemplar that exemplifies living the good life in some particular way, maybe not totally. They can be a bit of an anti-hero, that's fine. But someone that exemplifies a virtue and that you want to be like. We're going to like do this in practice, because this is what virtue ethics is, right? Is practicing this a little bit. So break into small groups. I'll put us into, let me pause the recording.
Sort of like Cristiano Ronaldo being like an example of courage and taking the confidence into not striving for or not putting your life into something, say like school, that could give you a higher percentage of, you know, a career in life, but taking it all the way and putting all of your heart into a smaller aspect or a smaller percentage of having a good career.
Yeah. So, okay. This is actually a really good example because LeBron James is a very controversial figure. In context, he has been known to be a nice person. Also in context, he has like terrible sportsmanship and like an ego the size of the moon, and you know, nothing will get in the way of the satisfaction of his ego, be it loyalty or lack of money or anything really. But he's also like a family man, and you're right. So what I just pointed out are like negative qualities, right? Humans are humans, and we're all a little messed up, right, in our own ways, and sometimes a little more than less. Hopefully less than more, but you know, that's what we are working on. So in LeBron's case, I just pointed out like a bunch that's kind of wrong with him. But what you did is you picked out something that is worth admiring in LeBron. You find the best part of someone, you appreciate that, and you can love anybody, right? This is just like that's wisdom to live by. Find one thing. That's it. That's all it takes. And you can experience compassion for someone, but not just compassion. But in finding and loving that one thing about somebody, if it's just one and maybe more, what we do is we attach ourselves to a certain structure of quality of being a person that's good and that we admire. So in the case of LeBron, despite his moon-sized ego and sportsmanship issues and you know, general assholery from time to time, he risked a lot, right? To become the athlete that he is, to follow his dreams and his passion, and to work harder than anybody, and to have the like physical body that's required to be like among the greatest basketball players of all time. That this kind of person, it requires a tenacity of spirit and a almost like bullheaded stalwartness in the face of terrible odds. Like nobody becomes an NBA player, right? But everybody plays basketball. And that is, in spite of like the bad stuff, that's what we admire. So what happens in exemplarism is you pick your exemplar, and they're your exemplar because you admire some quality or trait. And just because you like the quality or trait doesn't mean that they're a good or bad person. But what is supposed to happen is that they transmit to you a lesson about what it is to live well and be a good person, and you appropriate that. And if we can like admire lots of people and lots of good stuff about people and appropriate those things and make ourselves become our own exemplars for others, everybody starts thinking that in that way. We have a lot more compassionate and healthy world that lives a good life. Good. Do anybody else come up with some exemplars? No. Just LeBron. LeBron and Edward Snowden. It's an interesting one. Usually it's like, usually. Yeah,
My exemplar, should I share mine?
Yeah, please.
My exemplar is Kendrick Lamar because I think he's very creative and intelligent and wise, but he also like stays humble despite his success.
Yeah. Or so he says. Yeah. Good. Yeah, and if LeBron has an ego the size of the moon, then Kendrick's problem is that he's really short. Kidding. Yeah, Kendrick, I kind of don't like Kendrick's music. Like I just like never choose to listen to it, but I respect it. I think it's really good. Just like doesn't aesthetically click with me. But yeah, I think he's also like, you're right. Part of the reason that like, just like his sound of hip hop just doesn't click with me. But part of the reason that I still like respect him a lot myself is for what he says. Like he's really creative, and like watching his performance at Super Bowl and at the Grammys last year or 2 years ago, they're just like, he's choreographing and stuff. He's doing all that, right? He's a brilliant artist, both in terms of like motion and music, and you can see that he's doing it in a way that only he does, right? His flow is like perfectly his own. It's like not derivative of any other rapper out there, hip hop artist. He's like himself and really good at it. And so he has kind of this like creative independence from the world around him, and in a way that like makes something new of hip hop and rap, of his art form, but is also wildly popularly received, which is rare in creative acts. Like creativity is like weird because it's new and original and people aren't used to it, but doing something that's creative that's also like received widely is an achievement. And he does that through both creative independence and like social communication. It's like a perfect blend of those. So yeah, I like Kendrick as well. And he is humble. So he says. I don't know. I've never met him. I don't think I've watched any Kendrick interviews either. Be an interesting thing to see. Okay, so let's talk about Aristotle. Get back into the sauce. So Aristotle invents logic and biology and physics and philosophy for the next like 1,000 years, basically, like until Descartes and Galileo, everybody was Aristotelian. And his logic is still useful now. So if you take a logic class, if you take my logic class, we'll do okay, so this is a Venn diagram, and with S over here and P over here. So this is the intersection of S and P, and maybe something is S but not P, so we'd put an X over there to say the object exists in this Venn diagram, this sort of thing. The Aristotelian logic is set of formal inferences, and they all have names that you would have to memorize if you were in school in medieval England. But we don't have to now. That, you know, is like Venn diagrams are basically based off of, and we can see in this square thing here, but it's useful because we get cringed and based stuff. It's kind of fun. He was also Plato's graduate student for 20 years, which shouldn't surprise you when I say, as his graduate student for 20 years, Aristotle disagreed with just about everything Plato wrote. Said, look, this guy was completely wrong. And where Plato is interested in the world of forms and, you know, like heady things in space and mystical whatnot, Aristotle is like looking at the ground and figuring out how plants and animals fit together, and how rocks roll down hills, and like what time is, and all this. He's like the first, it's hard to say because you have Empedocles and Thales and stuff, but Aristotle is the first philosopher of science that does science in a way recognizable to us, and invents all sorts of sciences. It's just an incredibly important thinker, and we only have his lecture notes. So the only reason we have any of Aristotle's writing at all is an accident. It was probably in the Library of Alexandria, which burned down, RIP. But Aristotle was also the advisor to Alexander the Great, who is a Macedonian and not an Athenian. Okay, so Alexander conquers Athens, and Athens is democratic. Like if you've read the Oresteia, you get like the Aeschylus's, I think it's Aeschylus, it's the Oresteia. You get this like story of the origin of democracy through Athena in Athens, and like the invocation of justices in the court, like all of this is invented. And so like Athens just has this huge tradition of freedom, right? And Alexander takes over Athens, dominates it, and along with the rest of the world. And Aristotle is his tutor. Aristotle like travels around with Alexander and teaches him things, and then goes back to Athens. But when Alexander dies and the Hellenistic Empire splits up into, you know, like the 7 or 8 different empires that it did, like all of Alexander's great generals like took a giant chunk of land. Like Ptolemy took Egypt, and there's like the Seleucidae and all sorts of stuff. Aristotle is now remembered as the teacher of that guy who took away our freedom and our ability to like vote and be self-enfranchised Athenian people. And so they're pissed at him. And so Aristotle runs away. Very different from Socrates, right? Socrates, similar story, right? Like all of society is pissed at him, and he says, screw you, I'm not going to stop doing philosophy. I'm going to do it right here because I'm Athenian. And then he gets killed. Aristotle learns his lesson, afraid for his life, runs away, and all of his works are like saved by some follower of his in Athens, and then like they get forgotten about in a basement, and then the house collapses, and then like 100 years later, somebody like digs them up. And so we just have what was dug up in that basement, and it's like his lecture notes, right? It's like he was supposed to have written a lot more, all sorts of dialogues like Plato and maybe some plays and like actual works of philosophy, but these are his stripped down stories that he would give to his students in the academy. And still through this like minuscule portion of the works of Aristotle, we have the invention of biology and botany and physics and time metaphysics, all this stuff, right? It's just wild, right? The guy is like hugely important for the Western intellect. And this is especially true for today in his book that he wrote to his son Nicomachus about how to be a good person. So what we read for today was the first book from the Nicomachean Ethics. And it begins with this: every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and choice, is thought to aim at some good. And for this reason, the good has rightly been declared to be that which all things aim. If then there is some end of things we do, which we desire for its own sake, and if we do not choose everything for the sake of something else, clearly this must be the good and the chief good. There is general agreement for both the general run of men and people of superior refinement in saying that it is happiness, and identify living well and faring well with being happy. So what is Aristotle saying here? He's saying like, look, we all want what's good, right? But we probably mostly want what's ultimately good over just what's partially good. We don't want something that's good for the sake of something else. We want like the good. And what does everybody who knows anything at all say is, well, they say that it's happiness. What do the people of superior refinement say? This is a strategy that Aristotle takes. He begins with what's like the endoxa, the beliefs, that's the Greek for belief. He begins his discussions with the general beliefs of people. So Socrates said, hey, what do you believe in? Let me show you that you don't actually know what the heck you're talking about. Aristotle says, look, it's well received that this is what we know. Let's work from there. So it's kind of like totally opposite strategy. And is really clever in appropriating beliefs and then like helping develop those beliefs into a better form. So it's like non-contradictory and stuff. Like we talked about Parmenides in the first week, which says like it is, and it is not, right? We remember this. And Aristotle takes this and says, this is just like a misunderstanding of the world, of the world, but takes it seriously and then redevelops it. He's doing the same thing here, saying like, look, everybody says that happiness is the ultimate end. So let's investigate what that means and what that would look like. Happiness is the translation of eudaimonia, which is has two roots, eu, meaning happy, eu, and daimon is soul. So Socrates talks about his daimon in the Apology quite a bit, that his daimon's like speaking behind him and telling him to like inquire why he's the wisest in Athens, and ask people what it is to have this virtue or that virtue. That his daimon is like little spirit, that like voice in the back of his head that itches him forward and tells him to be good and how to do good. It's sort of like the inner voice of each of our souls, right? And happiness here is not just happiness in the I feel good, but in that inner voice of my soul is doing well. So it's sometimes also translated, eudaimonia is sometimes translated as flourishing, doing well generally, right? Because of this, it's not just like an emotional happiness, but a deep-seated like quality of soul happiness, good spirit. Okay, talked about that. Okay, so first chapter of book 1. The good is thought to be that end or telos at which things aim. So this is the telos is language from the physics 1, I think is where he does this. But he says, look, there's 4 kinds of causes. There's the material cause, the efficient cause, the formal cause, and the final cause. We don't have to know this, but just for fun. Think of a block of marble. Okay, so the block of marble is the material cause of Michelangelo's David, right? It's the block from which it came. The efficient cause is the hammer and chisel that carves into the marble. So the efficient cause of the David is the hammer and chisel. The formal cause is the artist's, Michelangelo's idea of like carving the block of marble into a David. So like the form that he sees in it. And then the final cause is something else. A telos is that for the sake of which. So the formal cause is like the artist sees it and tries to like produce it in the world. The final cause is already out in the world and it draws us to it, which is spooky, right? That's not a very like scientific view, right? To say that there's some cause out there in the world that draws us into things, that the matter is trying to organize itself in a certain sort of way, that the block of marble has in it, independent of the artist, the David already, but it's what the block of marble has in it, plus it's being a block of marble, plus the hammer and chisel, plus the artist's idea that combined together to create the artwork. And what Aristotle says the good is a kind of telos, that end for the sake of which we act. It's not a reason that we act, but it is why we act at all. It's what draws us to it. So you might say that the target is the end for the sake of which we shoot the arrow. We don't, the shooting the arrow doesn't require a target, but having a target is what gives us the ability to aim and to give reason to our shot. And so Aristotle thinks there needs to be some principle out in nature that allows us to organize our actions and our behaviors to make sense of what's out in nature. And these are telos, ends for the sake of which. And the good is going to be something like this. Where there are ends apart from actions, it is the nature of the products to be better than the activities. And just because it's an end doesn't mean that it can't be an activity. Some activities have their own ends. So like looking at a sunset, like you don't have to like hit a target for like, there doesn't have to be a target. You can just have this interminable end is like the word that gets used in contemporary philosophy. So an interminable end is an activity that you don't complete, like looking at a sunset is valuable in its own, and it never, it's not like you achieve some goal, right? The goal doesn't draw you like the completion of the David or whatever. It's just in having the experience at all, it interminably produces its own end. So the activity can be an end for the sake of which. And there are many actions, arts and sciences, and many ends. But when these all fall under a single capacity, in all of these, the ends of the master arts to be preferred to the subordinate ends, for it is the sake of the former that the latter are pursued. So why do we become biologists? Why does somebody become a biologist?
I guess figure out like the biological process of how we got here.
Good. And why does someone become a chemist?
Trying to understand what makes matter behave the way it does.
Good. Why does somebody become a
Physics, too.
why does somebody become a philosopher?
They're masochists.
Yeah, because they're a masochist.
To try to understand the world around them.
Yeah, masochistically. Thanks. You're not wrong. Good. So you don't become a biologist to have the knowledge of giraffes. You don't become a philosopher to know that Descartes said cogito ergo sum. You don't become a chemist to know H2O. That these are subordinate activities for which there's a greater end, which is understanding like the life systems in the case of the biologist, or in the chemist, the systems of molecular structure in the universe, or in the case of the philosopher, who knows what the heck, everything, nothing, but whatever, right? That there are subordinate ends which are superseded by the more primal important ends, those ends for the sake of which. And what Aristotle will ultimately say is, look, even these like greater ends all themselves bottom out somewhere else, which is in happiness, right? So why do we want to know how the world works in X, Y, or Z ways? Because we want to be happy. We want to live a good life. And we think that that's how we do it. And we might be mistaken, right? We might just be like driving ourselves off the edge of a cliff, who knows, right? But at least that's how like the structure of desire and motivation goes for Aristotle. And he says, look, when it all comes down to it, we all share this end. We all have this end of happiness. We might try to realize it differently, just as the bodybuilder and the diabetes person need different amounts of calories. We all might realize this end, that for the sake of which we act, which is happiness, differently, but the reason is the same across all people. So that's argument from chapter 1. Chapter 2, what is the good? What is the human good? How do we identify it? So if there is a human good, says Aristotle, will have two features. One, it's a goal that will pursue for its own sake and not for the sake of something else. So somebody have an idea of something we might pursue for the sake of something else? An example? Good, yeah, it's the clearest one, right? So why do we want money? Not to sit on it like a dragon, like hoarding gold in a mountain. What good does that do us, right? you get money to spend it, right? You want to have food and shelter and fun, right? So money is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. Happiness is an end, that for the sake of which all other things aim. Okay, and the other property is that for any goal which we pursue it for the sake of some human good. So we're not motivated primarily to do something that isn't good for us. He thinks that we have to be involved in the things that we call good and value. So in sum, if there is a human good, it's the ultimate end of all of our actions, and it's the only goal that we pursue for its own sake. So Aristotle says, our discussion will be adequate if it has as much clearness as the subject matter admits of, for precision is not to be sought for alike in all discussions. We must be content then in speaking of such subjects to indicate the truth roughly in an outline. In the same spirit, therefore, we should should every type of statement be received, for it is the mark of an educated man to look for precision in each class of things, just so far as the nature of the subject admits. So what he's saying in chapter 3 is like, look, we're talking about the end at which all things end. This is going to be big and complex. Let's at least like hedge ourselves and say, we're not going to give necessary and sufficient conditions that just tell us what happiness is, but we can use examples to get us closer. And what do you think the examples are going to be? They're going to be virtues, right? What's an example that helps us get at what it is to live a good life is an emotive quality in people that allows them to live well. And this is how we understand what this really big giant thing of happiness is we take it in chunks. We take little component parts and we put them together, and then we get a better idea of what we're trying to do. So now chapter 4. Is there such a human good? Is there such a thing, an activity for which all of our ends aim, that is the ultimate good, that's a human good, and that can be explicated through chunked examples? Okay, good. What is the other thing? Okay, it just says eudaimonia. Okay, so here's where we start to get some conceptual analysis from Aristotle in chapter 5. Now he's going to say what eudaimonia isn't. Well, it's not pleasure. It's not feeling good, because feeling good is not an end in itself. Feeling good is like a symptom of living well, but is not itself living well. Nor is it merely honor, nor is it merely the possession of virtue. These things and everything else we do gets its value because of its contributions to happiness. These are like the subordinate ends, right? In our example with the different disciplines, right? That having the particular knowledge of any field isn't enough to explain like why we're motivated to do it. You need like the bigger, more holistic answer. Same thing with any of the component parts of happiness. None of them alone like explain what's going on. They're all just indications that we're like on the right path. These goods are value dependent on the ultimate good. So happiness is what's important, he says here. But what is happiness? To say that happiness is the chief good seems a platitude. Like, okay, great. What do we learn from that? And this is like, it's clever. Aristotle saying like, look, we can't just say happiness is the chief good. We need to unpack that. And a clear account of what it is still desired. This might perhaps be given if we could first ascertain the function of man. Really important, function of man. So he's not gonna do some strange philosophical in his head armchair concept discovery of what happiness is. No, he's a scientist first and foremost. He's going to discover what happiness is by looking at the empirical facts on the ground, which is the function of humans. What do humans do, and how does that tell us what happiness is? Not what do I think humans are and what do I think happiness is, right? That's not enough. For just as a flute player, a sculptor, or any artist, and in general, for all things that have a function or activity, the good and the well is thought to reside in the function. So it would seem to be for man if he has a function. So if we're going to find out what the ultimate good for human beings is, what we commonly refer to as happiness, then we must look to the function, ergon in the Greek, of a human being, because that's where happiness resides. So a good X is just something that performs the function of X well. A good flute is one that makes pretty sounds. A good flute player is one who knows how to play the flute well, right? a good human is one who does the human thing well, whatever that is. So we get the ergon argument, really important in Aristotle. So to find out what's good for an X, we first look at the function of it. How do we know if something is a good banana or a bad banana? Like what makes a fruit good or bad?
The ripeness of it.
Yeah, the ripeness of it. And if it's overripe, it's excess, right?
Yeah, I don't like an overripe fruit, so I wouldn't get it.
Good for banana bread, right? That's the best you get. And if it's underripe, but why do we like ripeness? Well, because it's nutritional for us, right? It's like where we get the most value from it physically. So the function of the object with respect to us is to give us nutrition, right? And if it's in excess or deficiency of its directive force towards that function, right? It's overripe or underripe, then it's not going to fill it well and we'll consider it bad, right? So this is how we determine like what is good or what is bad with respect to the human experience as we look at the functions of things. So have the carpenter then and the tanner certain functions or activities and man has none? Well, it seems like being a human is like being a carpenter. There's an analogy. So we can draw the analogy between these two things and we can say, well, what makes a good carpenter or what makes a good tanner? And if that's analogous to being a human, then we should be able to also derive a function of being human and determine what makes a good human too. So if the parts of human society or an individual human at all have functions, then the whole must also have a function, a set of humans, right? The parts of humans do have functions. Therefore, human society has a function, right? So if each part is functional, then together the whole will be functional. Therefore, the whole has a function. What then can this function of humanity generally be? Life seems to be common even to plants, but we're seeking what is peculiar to man, right? So we're not looking at the vegetative quality. What Aristotle calls the nutritive. Plants take in nutrition, so do humans, but that doesn't distinguish us, right? What distinguishes us is something different. We also have an appetitive quality, humans, and so do, say, animals. The appetitive, like the desire-based feature. It's the tripartite soul, and I think I have a graph of it. Yeah, I do, in fact, here. The tripartite soul says, look, there's a nutritive, the appetitive, the desire thing. Animals desire things. They like want to eat and sleep and they feel and stuff. But what they don't have, says Aristotle, is reason. Whether or not this is true, this is how Aristotle characterized it. What distinguishes humans from animals and plants is not their emotions and desires. It's not their physical life forms. It's their rational capacity. So if we're to find a function that is specific to the human experience, that we can derive a principle of what makes that human experience good or bad through its function, right? Then we need to look at what distinguishes the human from everything else, which turns out to be the rational part of the soul, which is expressed through intellectual virtue. This is why he thinks that intellectual virtues are more important than the character ones. But that's a complex issue that we won't deal with for now. So the function of a human being must involve acting, not just having the capacity to act, in a way that no lower level creatures, plants or animals, can act. So reason is this quality. So there remains then an active life of the element that has a rational principle, activity in accordance with reason. This is the human function, right? And this, like, I get the argument. It makes some assumptions about animal cognition, but like, grant Aristotle his maybe impoverished view of animal cognition. It makes sense to me that if you want to find out like what it is that humans do, you first ask yourself what makes humans unique, and then you say it's that thing if it's active, which it is. In the case of reason is used. You say that unique distinguishing feature is what also produces the function of humans. So here's the argument in full. Maybe we won't do, it's getting kind of late, been like an hour and a half. So I won't do the what's wrong with it. But if you want to think about this on your own time, it's kind of a fun one. There's a lot to say and object to. So the conclusion is just that the function of human society is activity in accordance with reason, right? Because that's what distinguishes us. So humans themselves and human society as a whole have a function of acting in accordance with reason. So if that's our function, what makes that function work well? What's the human good? For all things that have a function or activity, the good and the well is thought to reside in that function. So it would seem to be for man. Now we know that that function is acting in accordance with reason, done well, and with excellence. So happiness, the human good, is activity involving reason in conformity with excellence. And just as a side note, this Sarah Brody is a contemporary philosopher. She says, look, Aristotle isn't talking to someone like Thrasymachus from Plato's Republic, who would say that everything I do is hedonic and for the sake of my own good, and I don't care about anybody else. Aristotle's just not taking that kind of view seriously. He is saying, look, I'm not going to motivate or argue for the importance of activity in accordance with reason being something that we're all interested in and being our like motivating activity as humans. Because if you think in that like purely psychopathic, sociopathic sort of way, you're just not on my level, and we won't be able to communicate about anything else, which we might think is a weakness in his argument. But again, I mean, it would be like a whole other book to even justify that the rational activity of humans is the function of man and motivating. So he just sort of takes that part for granted. So as Aristotle concludes, excellent activities or their opposites are what determine happiness or the reverse. Now, many events happen by chance, and events differing in importance, small pieces of good fortune or of its opposite, clearly do not weigh down the scales of life one way or the other. But a multitude of great events, if they turn out well, will make life more blessed. Well, if they turn out ill, they crush and maim blessedness. Yet even in these nobility shines through when a man bears with resignation many great misfortunes, not through insensibility to pain, but through nobility and greatness of the soul. For the man who is truly good and wise, we think, bears all the chances of life becomingly and always makes the best of circumstances. As a good general makes the best military use of the army at his command, and a shoemaker makes the best shoes out of the hides that are given him. I think this is like, it's like good wisdom to live by, right? Like you do your best. We're all given a lot in life. Whether or not we have free will, who knows? But it's not up to us to like change fate, because we can't do that. It's to make the most of it that we can, right? Just as a shoemaker with the hides that they're given, the shoemaker might have really crappy hides, but they can still make good shoes qua the quality of the hides. And that might just be the best that you can do. And if that's all you're doing it well. You don't need to make the best shoes ever to be a good shoemaker. You need to make the best shoes that you can out of what your lot is to be the good shoemaker. And I think this is a really sensitive and helpful point when thinking about ethics generally, because when we think of like moral exemplars, people that come to mind are often like, you know, Gandhi and Mother Teresa pre-realization of the kind of person she was. Like these like super good people that did like amazing things in the world, that moved the world forward, turned it, and just like are scions of love and compassionate goodness, right? But those cases are so rare, so few and far between, so divorced from like everyday life. What makes an everyday person good? What makes each of us okay? What helps us live a good life in accordance with reason and happiness? It is doing our best, right? And sometimes your best won't be very good, but that's okay, right? As long as you did as well as you could, then you're living the good life. And it may not always feel good, but it could be better. And that is what makes the difference in this kind of system of ethics, which is why I put it after the other two. And, I personally prefer it, but there you go. That's the end. Virtue ethics. Congratulations. You made it all the way through our ethics section. Next unit is proofs for God's existence. We'll do some philosophy of religion, fun stuff. And then after that, I think we do some flow states, action, and embodiment, like my personal research and work. And we'll have the interesting dance thing. I still don't know what's going to happen in that class. It'll be fun. I have to work with the choreographer that I invited to class to like build our lesson plan still, but that'll be fun. I hope it'll be interesting and a different way of learning, like watching ideas be taught rather than like hearing them be taught. That's kind of what I'm hoping to do through it. So we'll see. And then we're done. So just like a month left, something like that. Yeah. 4 or 5 weeks. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Go out and live a good life. Be virtuous people. Become exemplars in your own lives and do good stuff.
Thanks. Have a good one.
Thank you.